This is Victoria, and she was a flight instructor taking a student on his very first flight. Unfortunately, something went terribly wrong and they crashed just a few seconds after getting airborne, and tragically, Victoria did not survive. That's why today I'm going to talk about the real pilot mistake that got Victoria killed. However, that's not the only story that we're going to talk about, because I also want to share with you the story of Alexis. She was a student pilot with an incredible future ahead of her, but unfortunately, she died when her flight instructor made a tragic mistake during a routine training flight. Now, these are both two very different stories, and they both have very tragic endings, but I felt it was important to share them both because they both involve flight instructors and students, and I think there's some really good lessons that we can take away from all of this. I'm Hoover. Welcome to your pilot debrief. Again, this is a live stream, something new that we're trying out here for a little bit. And if you could, please, if you have questions, drop them in the live chat, and I'll try to get to those at the end. But if you're watching this on the replay, I'm going to try to keep this structured almost like a regular video so you guys can get the most out of it as possible as we walk through all this. So I want to start with Victoria's story and give you a little bit of background on what's happening here if you're not familiar with her tragedy. This took place back on October 6th of 2022. It was at the Newport News Williamsburg International Airport, which is just to the north of Norfolk, Virginia. And it's an area I'm somewhat familiar with because, I did a lot of my flying out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, flying Strike Eagles. And this airport, you can see on the map here, it's right next to Langley Air Force Base, so the headquarters for Air Combat Command for the Air Force. And I remember when this story came out, there was a lot of speculation and rumors about what might have taken place. So I kind of want to walk through some of that as we do this. And just for reference, the flight school where Victoria worked is located at the north end of the airport. They've got two runways there. And this was supposed to be a routine training flight. Victoria was in the right seat up front, and her student was in the left seat. But there was also a third person that was along for the flight sitting in the back. And when the news agencies or the news companies were reporting on this initially, they talked a lot about how, it was two students on the flight. And it's like, well, why would you have two students on the flight and this and that? And so we're going to get to that as we go through these people here in a minute. But they taxied out for takeoff from runway 20, which is, as you can see depicted on the image here. So a very short taxi out to the runway, getting ready to go. Now, as soon as they got airborne, the aircraft entered a steep nose-high pitch attitude. It got about 200 feet in the air, and they crashed off the side of the runway. And there's video footage of that we're going to take a look at later. But for now, one of the first things that came out with all of this was the audio. I know a lot of you guys follow along with live ATC. They're very good about getting the audio of these tragedies out there right away, and it helps us to kind of figure out what might have happened in certain instances. And this was the radio call that everybody was talking about. 883, runway 20, cleared for takeoff. Caution wake turbulence for the intersection from the departing fighters. Right turn on course is approved. Now, it's not a perfect radio call, but what the controller is essentially telling Victoria is that there are some fighter aircraft. They're taking off from the other runway. And at the intersection where those two runways meet, there might be some wake turbulence that she needed to be aware of. And so we know that Victoria taken off from runway 20. We've got the fighters taking off from runway 25, going that direction. And where those two runways intersect, wake turbulence is definitely something that you need to be aware of as a pilot. One of the things that I talked about in a video a while back was a student pilot that crashed due to the wake turbulence from a helicopter that he was landing behind, because I think wake turbulence from helicopters is something we don't talk a lot about. But in this instance, it was a big issue that was brought up, and people were talking about it. And I kind of, for somebody with a lot of aviation experience, and for those of you that are pilots out there, you can take a look at this and we can see that based on where the crash site is, wake turbulence was not really going to be a factor in this, because the aircraft crashed before she got to that intersection of those two runways. So it was never an issue. And that's why again, it's so important not to speculate on these things when they come out in the news, because until you start digging into the details, you don't really have that full picture about everything that took place. Now that the NTSB, was able to rule that out pretty quickly, they started taking a look at the instructor herself. And I wanted to share her story because I think for, whether you're a student pilot or a flight instructor or a retired pilot, or, or wherever you're at, or even just an aviation enthusiast, it's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to, reflecting back, especially, for those of us that are pilots today. Victoria documented everything on Instagram. And I think it just really showed her true love for aviation and how much she was committed to doing this and making this a full-time thing. Her journey began in May of 2019. So, almost about 3 years prior to when this tragedy happened, she started working on her private pilot license. She ended up getting that about 2 months later, at the end of June of 2019. And that meant she was most likely doing this full time, flying, 3 to 5 days a week, putting those hours in, really, really busting her butt to make it happen. Because typically what you see in some of these tragedies is, people that are doing this on a part-time basis because they've got careers and other things going on. And so it typically takes a little bit longer. She eventually got her instrument rating about 9 months later in March of 2020. And then she made this post on Instagram in January of 2021. It was another 9 months, gone by, showing that she had finally got 200 hours of total flight time. And then obtained her commercial certificate in March of 2021 with the desire now to, pursue becoming a flight instructor. By November of 2021, she was taking her written exams. There's 2 written exams you have to take for that. And then, a few months later, she ends up becoming a certified flight instructor in April of 2022. At the time of the crash, she was 22 years old, certified flight instructor. She had about 330 hours of total flight time, but only about 75 hours as a new flight instructor. But I think, again, like I said earlier, it's definitely a journey that a lot of us can relate with, going through the process of becoming, a pilot and then making those career progression moves along the way. The other thing that was obviously something the NTSB was going to take a look at was the student. Because remember, I said the news was reporting there were 2 students on the plane with her. The truth is there was only one. The student in the front seat and in the left seat, his name was Bo. And his last name's not important. I know what his last name is, but I can't pronounce it. So I just decided to take it off there, but I couldn't find an image of him. And that's not really important either. What we need to talk about is this was a guy, he was 18 years old. He was a freshman at the university. He wanted to be an airline pilot, but he had never flown before. And what I read about him, to me, it made it sound like he hadn't been on any aircraft before, not even on a commercial aircraft. And we know that he was very nervous about conducting this flight because this was going to be his very first time flying, and especially for him to be in a position where he can control the aircraft. So a lot of nerves going into that. And that's one of the reasons why there was another passenger on board the aircraft. The passenger ended up being a really good friend of his, or a friend of his. His name was Ashton. Now, Ashton, he was a student, but he was a student at the university, but he had a private pilot license that he had already obtained. And so he was a student that was working on his instrument rating. Now, this wasn't a training or an instructional flight for him. He was just mainly on the flight just to provide that support to his friend Bo and make him feel a little bit better about flying. Now, thankfully, somehow they both managed to survive the crash. And that's how the NTSB was eventually able to kind of piece together everything that happened on this tragedy. The aircraft they were flying was a 1984 Cessna 172. Again, you've got the 3 of them in there, and I don't know what size individuals, Bo and Ashton were, But we know that weight and balance was not a factor that was contributing to the crash. The NTSB didn't mention it at all. They didn't talk about it at all. And usually when that happens, it's because they dismiss it right away in terms of whether it's a factor or not. One of the things that they looked at, though, was the sequence of events that took place all the way up to the takeoff, and then how they got into that situation where the aircraft is crashing just a few seconds after takeoff. When it comes to the pre-flight, as they're getting ready to go out to the runway and getting the aircraft ready and stuff, remember, this is Bo's first flight. It's supposed to be an instructional flight. So there's a lot to take in, a lot to digest there. But there are some very simple objectives that instructors have for a student pilot going on their first flight. And Viktoria did a pretty good job of covering these based on the interviews that they had with Bo and Ashton afterwards. She talked about, here's how we're going to do a pre-flight. Here's how you're going to use a checklist. Here's how you're going to adjust your seatbelt, your shoulder harness, that sort of thing. And the plan was to let Bo perform the takeoff. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, because that's something that's definitely going to be a factor in what happened. Now, I'm going to show you a video of the takeoff. But before I show you that video, I want to let you know, first of all, it's very grainy video quality because of the resolution of the camera. So it's a little bit hard to see. And oops, let me pause it here. And then I'm going to cut it off right before the impact, because there's not necessarily anything of value that we're going to get out of watching that. But what I want you to pay attention to is how quickly this happens. You're going to see the aircraft right over here. It's just above my face on the screen here. And then you're going to see it kind of go above the tree line, and we'll take a look. Now, you can see how fast that happened. One of the big issues that the NTSB looked at when they saw some of this initial footage was whether Bo and Viktoria's seat was locked in place, or whether maybe there was an issue with the seat rail or something like that. Because as soon as you start pulling back on the controls, if your seat's not locked into place and that seat starts sliding back, it's very easy for you to just grab on that control wheel and pull back even harder, getting you into that excessive nose high attitude. And as I was researching that issue, I wanted to share this just brief side note here because I came across this other story. This is Brenda, and she was 56 years old. She's a certified flight instructor with 1,800 hours, and she was also doing a routine training flight with a student. And during takeoff, they ended up getting excessively nose high, and the aircraft rolled and crashed inverted right on takeoff. Now, in that situation, I think it was just relevant to share because the NTSB determined it was her failure to ensure that her seat was properly secured before takeoff that resulted in that loss of control. And one of the contributing factors was there was like a secondary seat stop that was supposed to be installed that wasn't installed. And, it just goes to show you that no matter what you're doing, sometimes we have all these holes in the Swiss cheese that line up that contribute to the ultimate reason for the crash. But with Brenda's case, it's just a very simple, basic mistake. Hey, she didn't check to make sure her seat was locked in place. The seat slid all the way back, and then that's it. And it's just heartbreaking to hear that somebody with that much experience could miss something like that, and it could turn out so tragically. And like I said, as I was looking at Viktoria's case, that's the reason I wanted to share this and bring this up, because I knew and everybody else knew that was going to be a very important thing for the NTSB to look at when they were looking at what happened to Viktoria. However, they discovered that based on the examination of the wreckage, and thankfully they were being able to interview both Ashton and Bo, they could determine that the seats didn't move during the flight. So that wasn't a factor that contributed to the crash. Now, before I talk to you about what the real pilot mistake was that got her killed, just be sure to stick around. We're going to also remember to talk about Alexis here in the second story. Now, the probable cause when it comes to Victoria was that, according to Ashton, who, remember, he's the pilot rated passenger, he's in the back seat. He said before they took off, Victoria told Bo that she's going to tell him when to start pulling back on the control wheel during takeoff. However, Bo said he didn't remember that. And he also didn't remember if Victoria told him how they were going to perform the takeoff roll. Ashton also said that Victoria was on the controls during the initial portion of the takeoff roll until they reached rotation speed. And then she told Bo to go ahead and start pulling back on the control wheel. And as Bo pulled back on the wheel, or pulled back on the controls, the airplane lifted off the runway, but he just kept pulling back essentially until the aircraft stalled. And there wasn't a lot of words exchanged there, because as you saw from the video, it was just, happened just like that. There really wasn't a lot of time for her to react. I think Ashton said, or either Ashton or both said they remember, Victoria, like, kind of expressing some, shock or screaming essentially, out, but wasn't able to do anything in time. And one of the big issues that I think is really the real pilot mistake in all of this was that neither Bo nor Ashton could remember Victoria providing any instruction about the positive transfer of flight controls. So again, it's very simple mistake. Hey, she gave all this instruction, everything was seemed to be going fine, but you forget to do one thing, and it just turns out so tragically. And the NTSB concluded that even though she had done all that instruction beforehand, just missing this one piece of critical instruction, it led to her getting into a situation where she didn't really anticipate that Bo was going to keep pulling back on the controls as soon as they got airborne. Now, in my opinion, positive transfer of flight controls is a huge thing. Anytime you're flying, whether you're flying with another pilot or an instructor or a passenger, you've got to understand who is flying the aircraft. There should never be any doubt. And sometimes, it's easy to get in a situation where you're having casual conversation. You're like, hey, can you watch the controls for me for a minute? Or I'm going to do this, or you're going to do that. And then the next thing you know, wait a minute, who's flying the plane and who's doing what? So, you really need to think about that, brief that thoroughly, beforehand, especially if you're an instructor flying with a student. And I think for Victoria, remember, she only had 75 hours as a new flight instructor. So it's not something that she probably had ever experienced with other students that she had flown with. And my guess is none of the other instructors had potentially warned her that this might be something that she might have to deal with on a flight. And it's just, it's just really sad and tragic that it turned out the way it did in this situation. And again, as you saw from the video, I think the other thing to just remember is that in that takeoff environment, when you're generating lift, and it's just so critical to be able to make to have effective communication when you're flying with somebody else, and to know what you're going to do either when something like this happens or when you get into an emergency situation right on takeoff, because you're low to the ground, you don't have a lot of time to react, and you got to make a decision quickly about how to process what's happening and how to take the corrective action necessary to keep the aircraft safely flying, even if that means, in her situation, karate chopping his arms off the controls, or if she couldn't overpower him with just pushing full forward on the control wheel, just to break the angle of attack, to reduce the angle of attack low enough to keep the aircraft flying. You may still crash, but at least this way, you're not developing into a full stall crash scenario. So and just something to think about in this type of situation. Now that brings us to the story of Alexis, and I think this was also a very tragic story that was worth sharing. Because you see these situations where people want to become pilots, or in Victoria's case, she had just become a new flight instructor, and now with the story of Alexis, you have a brand new student pilot, and then the guy to our left is the flight instructor that we're going to talk about. This is a picture of the aircraft after they were able to pull it out of the river where they crashed. But unfortunately, neither of them were able to survive. This story took place on the 18th of June, 2021. It's not too far from Jacksonville. You can see Jacksonville International is right below my face here on the map. But it happens at the Fernandina, I think is how you pronounce that, municipal airport. And you've got David and Alexis doing a routine training flight. They were supposed to go do some training over the St. Mary's River, just northwest of the airfield there. You can see the airport here with the location of the flight school. The instructor on this flight was held in very high regard. He's 66 years old. He was a retired naval aviator. He had quite a bit of experience as a flight instructor with about 4,000 hours of flight time. Now, when they go do the interviews with, other pilots that have flown with him and previous students that have flown with him, what they found was the chief instructor at the flight school where David worked out previously said he was very safety conscious. He was very professional. And I think one of the more tragic parts to this story that came out was they discovered that this was supposed to be David's very last day of flying. He had told, this was actually his second flight of the day. And on the first flight of the day, that's what he had told the student on that first flight. Say, hey, today's my last day of flying because I'm going to be retiring to spend some more time with his wife. The student flying with him, Alexis, was 18 years old. She graduated high school in May, and the accident happened in June. So she had only been out of high school maybe a couple of weeks and had a lot to look forward to. She had about 21 hours of total flight time. She was described as a very sharp student, always prepared, took flying very seriously. And we know that she had a full scholarship to go to Embry-Riddle. So a lot of stuff to look forward to. Now, according to the investigation, Alexis had actually started flying while she was still in high school, and she had been taking lessons at another flight school where she had previously soloed in a Diamond DA-20. But then she started taking lessons with David and at this new flight school, and this was her fifth flight with David. Now, the aircraft they were flying was a 1971 Cessna 150. And once again, just like the story with Victoria, they were able to determine there was nothing mechanically wrong with the aircraft that would have contributed to the crash. As I mentioned just a second ago, David had flown one flight earlier in the day with a different student. And in the interview they had with that student, they discovered that during that flight, they practiced some standard rate turns. They practiced low altitude engine failure and recoveries. And then they also practiced stalls, but they practiced those stalls between 1,000 and 1,200 feet. Now, the reason this is important is because when we look at the private pilot for airplane category airman certification standards, so kind of your guidelines here or the standards that you need to meet for private pilots, those certification standards tell you that, you need to select an entry altitude that allows the task to be completed no lower than 1,500 feet. The NTSB asked the student that had flown with David earlier in the day, hey, you said you're doing these stalls and these other things, 1,000 to 1,200 feet. Talk to me a little bit more about that and what your history is of flying with David. And they went and interviewed some other students as well to figure out what happened. and are you sure that was the altitude you were at, and that sort of thing. And the student said, well, listen, there are some instances where and previous flights where we might have climbed as high as 1,800 feet, but we never really got any higher than that. And definitely on the day of the crash, we were definitely down at that 1,000 to 1,200 feet. So now the NTSB has a pretty good idea of what might have contributed to the crash. By you've got an instructor that's maybe executing some low altitude or some maneuvers at an altitude lower than what he should have been. And I know everybody's going to kind of have their different take on what altitude you should be to start these maneuvers. I know most people will say 3,000 or 4,000 feet. The reality is the standards say 1,500 feet. You could start that maneuver at 1,600 feet, and if you complete it by 1,500, you pass the standards. But the question is, why would you try to do that? So, you're putting yourself in an environment where you're reducing, your ability to react and respond to things that might happen with the aircraft by intentionally conducting stalls or slow flight at a lower altitude than necessary. Now, the radar data from the flight, they didn't have, the aircraft didn't have ADS-B data. So these were just different. This was the radar composite track that the NTSB was able to put together. So it's a little hard to assess from this directly what happened. But we know that there was nothing eventful that took place on the departure and en route to the working area. The departure happened around 10:56 local, and then the crash happened about 9 minutes later over the river up to the north. We know that once they got established up there, they were doing some 360-degree turns. Those turns were being conducted at an altitude between 800 and 1,000 feet. And the last radar return, the aircraft was at 800 feet above the ground. So again, well below the minimum altitude that the aircraft should have been when conducting, intentional slow flight or stalls, that sort of thing. Ultimately, the NTSB determined that the probable cause in this, as they looked at everything that was feeding into this, they discovered that the flight school that David was working for had a written policy that their minimum altitude for stalls and other air work was 1,500 feet AGL. They learned that most of the instructors at the school perform their stalls and slow flight and maneuvers at a much higher altitude than 1,500 feet AGL. But ultimately, David had a history, not just with the previous student that day, but with other students, of conducting air work below 1,500 feet. And I don't say this to try to disparage David or paint him out to be, a reckless instructor or anything like that. I think sometimes, I've talked about normalization of deviance before, and that's where you have a situation where essentially, maybe at one point you had a standard for where you were going to, or the altitude you were going to conduct the maneuvers at. And then maybe one day weather forced you, instead of 3,000 feet, we got some clouds there, we're going to do a little bit lower. And then you're like, okay, well, maybe we'll do it a little bit lower next time, because I'm realizing I can save time on my flight. I don't have to spend time climbing up as high altitude. We can knock this out a lot quicker. I think there was also some discussion in this investigation about how David really tried to focus or tried to get these students to understand that, this is a critical environment to be in when you're lower altitude and something happens with the aircraft. So I want you to be able to recognize that and be able to recover the aircraft. And I know he, according to some of the interviews, he talked to his students about, when they're flying around low altitude, make sure you have a little bit of excess airspeed and in certain situations where if you're not within gliding distance of a place where you can land, if you have a little bit of excess airspeed, you can trade that airspeed for altitude to climb up higher and now reassess your situation, reestablish glide speed, and then find a place to put the aircraft down. So again, I think, I don't know, because I don't know David personally, but I know that from everybody that knew him, that have flown with him, they had nothing but good things to say about him. So you know, it's really tough to humanize these tragedies. You know, we want to look at the human factors that are involved, and nobody goes out there deliberately wanting to kill themselves or kill the person that they're flying with. You know, this guy was set to retire. So obviously just a very tragic situation in the story here with David and Alexis. And ultimately the NTSB determined that, you know, it was David's decision to conduct that slow flight training at an altitude below the flight school's minimum altitude, led to um, whether he, I don't know when they couldn't determine if he was practicing stalls or practicing slow flight, but it put him in an environment where the aircraft ended up stalling, and his delayed remedial action led to, you know, them crashing into the river. Unfortunately, this, you know, it was determined that they died on impact. You know, when that happened. So I know there's a lot of student pilots out there that watch these videos. I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that this is something that happens to you. You know, when I talk about these tragedies, just keep in mind that there are so many safe pilots out there and so many pilots doing the right thing. And the safety record that we have in general, you know, in terms of the aviation community, it's a really good safety record. The things that I would say that are good takeaways from both of these tragedies are, number one, is complacency. So don't ever become complacent, whether you're a student pilot or an instructor, or even if you're not a pilot at all. I mean, a lot of these lessons can also be applied to, you know, just driving down the road. It's so easy to become complacent in the things that we do, and all it takes is one little mistake. And then the other thing is the, you know, especially on the instructor side or for pilots that have a lot more time, is the normalization of deviance, just understanding how, you know, stepping away from the standards which you set for yourself, or the standards which you're called to operate by, and sliding that standard lower and lower because, hey, well, nothing happened this time, so it's not going to happen the next time. You get into those, you get into that pattern of doing that, and ultimately it ends up, you know, very tragic outcome. So I know this was a little bit shorter live stream than normal, but I wanted to hit both of those and then go ahead and open it up for questions, and we'll go from there. So I'll bring Sticks up on stage here.
Hey there. So I was getting a couple things down. So one question that came up with respect to wake turbulence
Yeah.
was what was the time interval between when the previous aircraft was taking off and when you would then be attempting your takeoff? And I have the answer to that, but if you want to answer it, I'll let you do that.
You're talking about on the same runway?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So when you get a caution for wake turbulence, how much time should you leave between when you initiate your takeoff roll and when your the other aircraft is
Yeah.
going?
I know it's,
That intervals. It's two
yeah,
minutes.
I think Steve answered there, 2 minutes. It's going to depend on the aircraft category too. You know,
Right.
so if you're a Cessna taking off behind a Airbus 350, you might want to wait a little bit longer
Right.
than taking off behind, you know, maybe a Learjet or something.
Right.
So that's
And
the big thing. My thing I would suggest is, if you're ever in doubt or if you ever have a concern, just tell the tower you're not ready. You
right.
know, don't ever get yourself forced into a situation where you end up making a bad decision. You can go back and look at the video on my channel that I did of the student pilot in the helicopter, and you can see the thumbnail looks like the image of that.
Right.
You know, he kind of, I think, felt almost like he was talked into that situation where, you know, the helicopter is like, oh, don't worry about it, we're just going to do this, you know, and
Right.
you know, and then he just kind of assumed he was going to be okay. So if there's ever a doubt in your mind, just, you know, go around, if you're landing or if you're departing, you know, just delay if you need to.
Right. Yeah, and my experience as well, when you're dealing with a helicopter, that you got to realize so that's the entire weight of that helicopter is roughly the force that's coming out of that rotor system. So do not underestimate the amount of rotor wash that's coming out from there. And the heavier the helicopter, the more rotor vortices you're going to see. And that
Yeah.
can completely disrupt your lift and cause a really bad day. And also realize that helicopters can do non-standard landings. So while we may be in the pattern for a runway, you may also then be finding yourself going to a parallel taxiway or something like that. So
Yeah,
don't forget that they can do a lot of weird stuff.
well, yeah, and in this in the video I covered too, like what was interesting was it was I think it was a Black Hawk, and he was landing, so he made his approach to the numbers right at the beginning of the runway, but then he hovered taxied down the runway.
Right.
So you're still generating a significant amount of lift when you're doing that and causing wake turbulence. Now, if he had actually landed and rolled, like
If
the
your
ground,
helicopter has wheels, but even still, you're still generating a lot of vortices, a lot
yeah,
more than you are with a fixed wing aircraft and a prop. So
yeah.
So anyway, so that was
What
one
else we
question.
got?
There was also a question that came up, and I thought this was a pretty good one. Is at what point, or maybe it was a question I was going to sort of propose. So at what point do pilots, does their risk actually go up? So you get your private pilot's license, and then there's a general hour window where we tend to see a higher risk for mishaps and accidents.
I don't. I think that's kind of false. I don't know
So
that
when
you.
I did a good quick look on that, and it's somewhere between 50, by some estimates, it's 50 to 300 hours.
Yeah,
And
I think.
I think a lot of it's the mentality and how you approach it. So
Yeah, I've heard people refer to a certain window of hours as like the kill zone, where you're at the highest risk. I think I've done a little bit of research on this a while back, and I feel like I want to say that it's really it's not as black and white as what people think it is, because we
right,
see that I mean, you guys know from watching the videos on this channel, like a lot of the tragedies I've covered, these are much older pilots who have thousands of hours of experience, and every now and then it's a student pilot, that right, actually I'll say very rarely it's a brand new pilot,
right,
that I think you won't see the kind of reckless mistakes and other stuff with the younger pilots. Somebody who doesn't have a lot of hours, you see just like they don't know what they don't know, and we've talked about this before, the Dunning-Kruger effect. How
right,
a brand new pilot, you tend to overestimate your skill capability, and underestimate the danger that you might be in for a given situation, or the threat that the weather might represent. Whereas on the flip side, you've got the older pilots that kind of overestimate. Well, I don't know the right word for it, but they're very confident in what they're doing because they've done it for so long, and they underestimate, I guess, how much skill it takes to actually do what they're doing.
right.
So it's
So
kind of like a curve.
yeah, I think there's there's a certain gap that exists between competency and proficiency.
Yeah.
Competency being that you can routinely get into the aircraft and do the maneuvers safely without without having a problem with it, versus demonstrating that you're competent at one point in time. So
Yeah, I'm going to throw a couple questions on here about David's career. I don't know. The FAA standards didn't change during his career, not that I'm aware of. And he was one of the things I didn't mention about him. He was an A6E intruder bombardier navigator.
He was an NFO. When I was looking at his flight suit.
Yeah,
his wings are NFO flight wings.
Yeah,
and,
so
but
he retired out of the Navy in 1999, and then he had a significant amount of time as a commercial pilot and flight instructor. So all of those hours that I mentioned, that was all his, as far as I'm aware,
flying hours.
Yeah, those were his as a rated pilot.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether the standards changed or not, the school had a defined set of standards that he was supposed to be operating by. And for some reason he wasn't, so So that's unfortunate.
I think your point about three-way transfer of controls. So in other words, I have the controls, you have the controls, I have the controls.
Yeah.
You know that so that positive transfer, closed loop communication is essential, especially in the instructor environment. And it's surprising to me how often it's not practiced.
Yeah.
And it really should be standard.
Do they even practice stall recovery at all? Yes, you do practice stall recovery
Yep.
for student pilots. That's a very critical skill. You have to know 1,500-foot stalls. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be doing them. I mean, you could start that. You could do your slow flight at 1,500 feet, and as long as you stay above 1,500 feet, you've met the standards.
Right.
Or I could start my, like I said, I could start my power on stall or off stall right at 1,500 feet, and as long as I'm do it exceptionally well and don't lose any altitude, I'm fine. But why? Like, there's just no reason to give yourself that extra altitude when you can. And
Yeah.
then, as far as I know, flight instructors are not required to have any liability insurance. Now, the flight schools that they operate for most likely are carrying some type of insurance. I don't know all the specifics on that though.
What's interesting and what was new to me was students when they now go start flight instruction,
Mhm.
they actually have to go get their own insurance as part of so my son started flight lessons.
Okay.
He needed to get and obtain his own insurance policy, which I found interesting. So
Yeah, I didn't have to do that in the 90s.
no.
So,
And then there was also an interesting question that came up is like somebody brought up the question about how old why these planes are so old, and why aren't there newer planes, and is that contributing? And so I don't know if you want to speak to that. It's
yeah, I'll get to that. Just a second. I hit this one here. And I don't know that do younger instructors generally charge less than experienced? I would say no.
Yeah.
It's going to, a lot of that's driven by the flight school specifically. Otherwise,
Yep.
if you're not doing it through the flight school, then it's going to be the negotiated rate. If you're doing like one-on-one flight instruction, so um, the question about the aircraft though, because I get that a lot of times is, like, well, the problem is these planes are so old. And that's just the way aircraft are built, but people need to realize these aren't like, they're not like cars, they're very different in how they operate, and not just how they operate, but how they're maintained. And then the requirements for annual inspections and everything else, compliance with directives and things like that to ensure the aircraft continue to operate in a safe and functional manner. Um, and if you were to go back and look at all of the mishaps that I've covered on this channel, I don't know that any of them were, the main cause was a malfunction with the aircraft. Now there might have
Right.
been, there's a couple where, yep, the pilot did everything he could. Something happened mechanically with the aircraft that led to a situation where the pilot had to respond and, either run a checklist or perform the correct action to keep the aircraft flying safely. And the pilot failed to do so, either because they were too low altitude or because they weren't current or proficient with their flying skills enough to actually be able to do that. So
Right.
those are the issues. It's, we still see to this day. It's almost always pilot error, you know?
Right. And if you're going to go out and do maneuvers like slow flight or stalls, and you the instructor haven't done them in a while, then you should go out in the plane before you take a student out and practice them before you're now trying to instruct and knock your cobwebs off, so to speak.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And thanks for the super chat. It's hard, like, cause you want to talk about the human factors involved, but you also want to be respectful of the family. And I'll share a real quick story. This past week I was out at Vid Summit, which is where all like the bunch of YouTube creators go to learn from other creators, stuff about YouTube. And I sat down at a table with this gentleman, shook his hand, said, "Hi, hey, what do you do? What do you do?" And I pointed my shirt. I'm like, "Oh, I'm pilot debrief." I talk about aviation mishaps. And he's like, oh, and he started getting a little emotional. He's like, well, I just lost some friends last month. I was friends with some people that, he's like, you might have heard of them, the Nealons, the gospel family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, oh
Yeah.
crap. I'm like, I just made a video on that,
Right.
and so
But
as I've said in other videos on this channel, I think maybe in live streams before, like I never want to say something in a video that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying to somebody, face to face, like as a friend or family member of somebody that survived the crash. So we had a really good conversation about, I told him like I did not want to cover that crash, right when right when it happened, just because there was stuff we still didn't know about it, and it's so easy to speculate, and I don't want to do that. So that's why it took me some time to make sure I was able to get as much information on it as I could, and then also find another tragedy that was similar enough, that had similar circumstances that I could talk to, because that other tragedy was what had all the information that I think we're going to find ultimately when the Nealon's investigation is complete.
Right.
So
generally there's an adage within these mishaps that, there's no new mishaps, there's repeats of old mishaps. And you don't have to dig too deep to find similar patterns within that. And that's what we have to be aware of. That's what we have to be looking for. And it's up to us to police ourselves. And that's why I think the whole concept of being an aviator is a vocation and not necessarily just, a hobby that we get into. So.
Yeah. And this goes back to the earlier question, but, in terms of when an airframe needs to be retired, I think it's ultimately going to be a maintenance call, on the structural wear and tear, maybe one too many hard landings, but that's ultimately part of the inspection process on the aircraft, and for maintenance, let the experts make that call. And that's why, I think, for a lot of general aviation pilots, if you own your own aircraft, you need to be, working with somebody that's qualified to do the maintenance. If you're not qualified to do that yourself, sometimes you see these situations where an aircraft is overdue for an inspection, and that is a mechanical issue, maybe that contributed to the crash. But usually if the pilot's, skimping out on the maintenance, like there's other stuff going on too, in terms of the pilot behavior that contributes to the mishap.
So there was, let's see, and actually, I think those were all the ones that sort of stood out to me. There was one interesting question that somebody asked about how do you get over a fear of heights when it comes to flying? And the thing is, it's going to be time in the aircraft, and it's also, you could try some other things like hypnosis, and also just a little bit of trying to work on getting yourself more centered and mindful. And it's time and repetition is the only thing that I could potentially recommend. The problem becomes if you start asking or thinking or considering medications. Obviously medications and flying don't work very well together. So
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I know, like I said, it was a little bit shorter live stream, but I think those are two kind of important stories to cover, and a little bit different, flavor in terms of the mishap that was involved. I want to thank everybody so much for your support. If you guys want to support the channel, head over to Patreon and find me on Patreon. You can support me there, or you can become a YouTube channel member, or you can get yourself one of these cool Aviate, Navigate, Communicate shirts on my website, pilotdebrief.com. Anything like that helps support the channel. Otherwise, just simply watching another video is the easiest way you can support for free. And YouTube loves it when you watch more stuff on the channel, and I appreciate it too. So that's all I got. Appreciate y'all.
Great.
Right.
Thanks, Hoover. Great job as always.